Hello and welcome to another episode of Wrestling with Memories. I am Wax, the Brain Hussein, and I'm joined by Fash, the $1 Million Fan. Fash, how are you doing?
I'm good, but before we get to business, Wax, I've got something to say. So the World Podcasting Federation got in touch with me this week, and they have officially declared me as the real world champion. And I can prove this because they've given me this big, shiny belt. And for those listening on the podcast, this is the most expensive belt that has ever been made by man. Now, Wax, if you want this title, you know where to find me after lockdown. But let me tell you something. I've sanitized it, and there's no way that I'm going to let your grubby hands or anyone else's grubby hands anywhere near this title. I'm the champion, and I'm going to be the champion as long as I want to be.
Well, Fash, I have waited 10 years for a challenge from you. 10 years my brain has been wasting away. Finally, an opportunity to use it. So you better be careful what you wish for, Fash. I'm coming for you and your $1 million.
I'll be waiting. I'll be waiting. Just you tell the authorities to end lockdown, and then we'll definitely have this battle of the ages. But now with that out the way, how you doing? How's the week been?
I'm good. The week has been very busy, but very exciting. I forgot how much fun it was to relive the era that we're going to be talking about. Doing my research, rewatching stuff. It brought a smile back to my face, and I was like so excited to get this going.
Yeah, similar. I mean, it was nice to get some feedback from people as well. So most people that we know that weren't aware that we were doing something like this. And actually people shared some of their early memories, and as we were hoping, they're very similar to ours. So that's the idea. I mean, hopefully people get in touch with us, let us know what they're thinking, give us feedback, but also share their journey. So yeah, for me, it was similar. I went back and looked at some things and remembered other memories as we were kind of talking about what we do. I guess in terms of today, are you ready to step in the time machine? And I want to take you back 30 years to February 1991. Now, do you have any memories of that period? What age were you?
Firstly, I think I would have been 6 years old, coming up to 6 years old. 30 years ago, it's a crazy
It's
number.
nuts. It's
It's a
nuts.
crazy
No,
number for an era of wrestling that we probably remember really well. And although I don't have specific memories before I started doing the research, because my memory is not great, but as soon as I did, it just clicked into place, and I remembered everything like it was yesterday.
that's the thing, because I was thinking back, and I was 7 at the time, which obviously we're revealing our ages here to the audience, but I guess it doesn't matter. We don't look a day over 16. But I was in Pakistan over that winter, and actually the thing that I remember is a topic that we're going to touch on today. I remember the Gulf War being discussed, and obviously the age we were, we didn't really understand what was going on, but you kind of knew it was something big. So I remember being here, then being there, and people discussing it, and being all over television, right? And there wasn't a lot of channels there, obviously, and certainly here as well. But there was something major going on, and I remember coming back to Glasgow in early February, and it was a snowy day, similar to what we have right now, and that really took me back. And remember, I think it was coming to an end, but I remember coming here and then still some chat around it. And that's the thing, in terms of wrestling, I hadn't still seen it, but what we learned going back retrospectively was that that major world event had been used by the WWF, and it's been one of the most controversial points in their history of whether they should have incorporated what was going on in the real world in a very serious situation into a wrestling storyline. So from a WWF perspective, in February 1991, they were in the middle of two events. So they'd had the Royal Rumble 91 in January, and they were going towards WrestleMania 7. And with two big matches at that event, the Ultimate Warrior against Randy Savage in a retirement match, and the big patriotic match, which was Hulk Hogan challenging Sergeant Slaughter for the world title. And Sergeant Slaughter was this big Iraqi sympathizer character, which we're going to dig into a little bit more. But in terms of, it was that transition point, but I think there was various things that happened leading in to 1991, which were actually quite important. And when you look at it from our fandom point of view, actually helped kickstart the boom that we saw. So I'm keen to chat about that. Going into 91, something big had happened in 1990, which was the Ultimate Warrior defeating Hulk Hogan. So were you a Hulkamaniac back in the day? Obviously I highlighted that you were into the bad guys, but in terms of the Hogan Warrior Savage debate, where did you stand?
I think out of the Warrior and Hogan, I was definitely a Hulkamaniac, and I know you were definitely
I was
a
definitely the
Warrior
Ultimate
fan.
Warrior.
So we'd always had that dynamic, and
Yeah.
there's not much to choose between the two, but and I adored both of them, and Macho Man in his own way as well. But yeah, I was definitely a Hulkamaniac.
Yeah, and that was the thing, because what we're talking about is not much to choose, but that was through our eyes, right? But ultimate, what happened, and I'm using the ultimate word there deliberately, was up to that point in 1990 at that WrestleMania, which was WrestleMania 6, Hulk Hogan hadn't lost cleanly since he won the title in 1984 to anyone. Now, there was a screwy finish in 1988 where he kind of lost, but there was cheating, and then they had a tournament and Randy Savage won. But a year later, WrestleMania 5, Hogan won it back. But this was the first opportunity when Vince McMahon saw another character to take over that spot. And that's when he lost cleanly to the Ultimate Warrior WrestleMania 6, and he was anointed as the next big thing. But by February of 91, he's already lost the title. So he lost it a month prior to that at the Royal Rumble. And to this day, people talk about how his title reign flopped. And that's one of the key things I want to discuss first, if that's a lot of hype around it or if it's true. Um, and my view is that it was a combination, okay, him not being the same PR type character and not the overall character that resonates with the masses relative to Hulk Hogan. But I think the way they presented him as a champion was a bigger failure. And I think it wasn't all his fault. I think the booking at the time, the presentation actually had lots of faults in it. And I don't know if you've gone back and looked at that period, because it's something that people discuss a lot, and have any thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the match between Hogan and Warrior, that was super successful. I know people always say, a face versus face match doesn't work up, but Pat Patterson, the genius that he was, created a match that worked for both of them. Didn't show any of their weaknesses, and it was entertaining. It was exciting, and I really do think at that moment in time we got the right winner,
Yeah.
and it was the right moment to pass the torch to the Ultimate Warrior. And from all of my memories, Ultimate Warrior was a super successful wrestler. The crowd was into him. We were into him. Everything with just his look was incredible. The tassels, the colors, the face paint. He had it all. And if I give you my memory from back then, I would always say he was super successful. Now looking back at it,
Yeah.
that's the interesting thing. And as you say, it wasn't deemed to be successful. But then I also wonder how many people are out there telling us that narrative. And me and you, we both know that Ultimate Warrior wasn't a popular person on the wrestling circuit.
Yeah, I mean, that's a key point, because most people that talk about him from that time, other wrestlers, people in management, he had issues with many people. And we're not here to talk about the person. It's more about the character and what he did. But I do feel up to now his impact, people tried to minimize it. WWE certainly hasn't in recent years post his death. They have now really given him the profile he deserves, because see, this goes back to what wrestling is. It's not always about who's delivering the 5-star match. It's about who are the
Yeah.
characters. And at that point, it was all about the characters, right? But I feel that the reason that he flopped really was because of how they presented him, in the sense that he never got out. One thing was, he never got out of Hulk Hogan's shadow, right? So even that match you're talking about, it's a great match. The right guy wins it. But then the spotlight's on Hulk Hogan at the end, because he goes and takes the belt and he hands it to the Warrior, and everyone then is. And I think Hulk Hogan wrote this in his autobiography. He was like, I did that so that everyone's eyes would be watching me leave the arena rather than the new champion. Though others have said that was always supposed to happen and it wasn't something he did on his own. So you can take what narrative you want. But I think the key thing was, Hulk Hogan didn't really leave after that point. So it wasn't like you've got the new champion, he's going to be the center point, as Hulk Hogan was, right? They still had Hulk Hogan in the limelight. And actually, the biggest feud coming out of that was Hulk Hogan getting attacked by a man that I'm sure some people will remember, and you'll remember, the Earthquake.
Yep.
on a segment which used to be called the Brother Love Show, and he essentially, crushed his chest as we all believed at the time, and they made Hulk Hogan go to hospital, and then they created this campaign where kids
Write
in the
letters
US were
in.
supposed to write letters to him and say "Get well soon." And what you learn later was the reason they were doing that. Do you know why they were doing that? What the gimmick behind it was? So it was later revealed that the point of getting kids to write letters was so they could get their addresses and send them
The
magazines for
yes, now I
subscriptions
remember.
and things. Yeah, so it was like a good marketing ploy. But that was the big kind of feud, right? Earthquake and Hulk Hogan post WrestleMania. Whereas if you look at the Ultimate Warrior, he was taking on guys like Haku, the Macho Man. His big title defense at SummerSlam was against Ravishing Rick Rude. Now, when you look at these three guys, right, there's three legends in different ways. But when you look at it from the eyes of the audience that doesn't know who's the tough guy behind the scenes and who isn't, these were all guys that either Hulk Hogan had already beaten or the
Yep.
Warrior had beaten. So if you're looking at it just as an audience, you're like, well, this isn't a new challenge. What's the big deal about this? Whereas this other guy, Earthquake, he's new and he's taking on Hulk Hogan, and there's some emotion behind that, right? Whereas I think, it should have been Earthquake Ultimate Warrior, because I think Earthquake had debuted in a segment with the Ultimate Warrior, and he's a champion now. So even if they were going to do that angle with him crushing Hulk Hogan, if the Warrior would then be defending Hulk Hogan, that could have been, huge. And we're not saying once again the quality of the matches would have been great. We're talking about just the fact positioning it and getting
Yep.
people emotionally invested. But they didn't do that. And there was, if you look at his defenses, the title defenses, it was like I said, Rick Rude at SummerSlam. And Rick Rude's one of the legends, right, of professional wrestling, but they'd already feuded a year before. So to the audience, that feud was done. Why are they taking each other on again? And prior to this, Rick Rude was feuding with Roddy Piper, a feud he lost. So there wasn't anything which kind of gave you a rhyme and reason behind that. And then he was later in the year, the LOD, which we're going to talk about, entered the WF, and he was doing 6-man tags with them as the champion. And then he goes into a semi feud with the Matchman where they don't actually take each other on. And then Sergeant Slaughter comes into the picture. So he wasn't really presented as the main guy. And for me, there was other guys they could have, put there if they really wanted to make it work, such as, Jake the Snake Roberts turns into a bad guy a year later, and he's feuding with the Warrior at the start of that. Now that could have been a really good feud. Mr. Perfect was on fire leading up to WrestleMania 6. For some reason, they made him lose to Brutus Beefcake at WrestleMania 6, and then he lost to Hulk Hogan after that event on national television, which then renders him not as strong in terms of a contender. Roddy Piper, who was a brilliant bad guy in the beginning boom of wrestling in 85, 86, was just commentating mostly in 1980 as a good guy. I mean, can you imagine if he was a heel taking on the Warrior? That could have been something different. So there was all these other options, say that they could have done to maybe make it more of a success, but they didn't go down that route. And I felt like Hulk Hogan was still, for whatever reason, the main guy. And it maybe goes back to some of your point that Hulk was liked by most people, the Warrior wasn't, and how much support outside of Vince McMahon was there actually there to make it work. And the box office, I think, at the time when we look at it, it wasn't that much of a success, and it was seen as he was still popular, getting the reactions and things, but it wasn't translating. And I think a lot of it had to do with not having the right opponents. And I think a secondary point was they also changed what made them popular. So I don't know, viewers and listeners might remember this, but the Warrior, as you said before, had a certain look that everybody remembers, and one element of that is the face paint. And they've said recently what they tried to humanize him so he'd be more, have more mass appeal. So he had the kind of paint on the cheeks. Do you remember the small kind of sticker? So trying to change his look, the way he was acting, they tried to change it a little bit. But the point is, he had a click with the audience. That's why they put the belt on him. So they're trying to change something that works as well. And to be fair, we'll talk about this in future episodes, but Vince and the team had a kind of habit of doing this with others as well. They would take a successful character and change him to mold him into more like a Hulk Hogan. And, down the line, there was Lex Luger, there was Kevin Nash's Diesel. And I think, changing what made him successful didn't work either. So, yes, he had deficiencies, but I don't think the booking and the structure around it helped.
Yep. No, I agree. But I think maybe we should focus on his deficiencies a little bit as well. He wasn't as giving a performer as Hulk Hogan was. He wasn't one to, you know, go out of his way to do all of these campaigns that Hulk Hogan would, that made Hulk Hogan so likable. And the problem is, how can you do that in Warriors, guys? You can't have Warrior on all these talk shows acting as a
Yeah.
Warrior would. Um, Almost ranting and raving was his way
That
of doing
was
promos. So it would be difficult to translate that into, you know, anything other than the wrestling business potentially. But no, I do agree that the booking played a part, and ultimately it won't be remembered as the best of Reigns, but certainly something that they needed to try because he was the man for that period.
yeah, and I think, you know, like I said, he's still remembered as the character as opposed to, you know, that championship run is not memorable.
No,
And you know, we'll be in specials, we'll cover some of the events of that period looking back, but it wasn't memorable till the end. And actually, after he loses the belt, and you're going to talk about the event where that happened, it goes back to being more interesting again. And at the end of it, when he lost the belt in January, he actually went back to the original face paint, more like the original character.
yeah,
So, you know, they changed something for the sake of it, realized there was no point in doing that. But then they'd chosen a different route anyway, and that was the end. But certainly still a very interesting period. And he's one of the kind of big what if stories, because as we're going to, you know, discuss as we go through the years, it was all stop start after the kind of summer of 91 with him, but still one of the biggest iconic names. And when we look at it, the only person of that era that came to that Hulk Hogan level,
yep,
no one else did. And when we talk about the success of being a champion, actually many champions that came after him weren't anywhere near successful. But here the comparison was with the greatest at the time,
yep,
Hulk Hogan, and that was something that, you know, it just didn't work, and it would have needed lots of different things falling in place for it to work. And as you say, the character didn't completely work in a mainstream way, and, you know, his own deficiencies in areas didn't help. And overall, you know, the positioning of it, if Hulk Hogan would have went away, say, for 6 months, 9 months, a year, it could have been a different story.
yep.
But at that point, people weren't ready to say goodbye to Hulk Hogan either.
No,
And that was the big thing. He was still, you know, something the audience loved and ultimately went back to.
okay, Fash. 1990 going into 1991 was a big roster change involved as well. Let's just talk about some of the talent that came in and left the WWF.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the big ones you'll remember is in the summer of 1990, the Legion of Doom entered the WWF, and I think a lot of the listeners and viewers will remember them. The big spikes, the crazy face paint, you know, similar to the Ultimate Warrior, and just I think when, you know, you refer to backyard wrestling, I think anyone that was a tag team would be or want to be the Legion of Doom. So Hawk
Yep,
and Animal, they came in. I mean, their history was they're the innovators of all this face paint, Mad Max type characterization. And they became really famous in the mid 80s, at which point other companies that didn't have them tried to create characters which were similar to them. And Vince McMahon actually wanted to bring them in I think 86, 87, but it never went through. So what he did was he also created a team which was a kind of seen as a knockoff of them called Demolition, Axe and Smash. And of course, you and I have names similar to those two. And after a couple of iterations, the initial Axe and Smash, they replaced the guy who was Smash because he was too recognizable from another team. They brought in somebody from the NWA, which you'll know more as WCW, by Darsaw, and he became the new Smash. And they were their version of the Legion of Doom. And actually, that team became really successful. I think they won the titles 3 times. And from that period, from 88 to about 90, the summer of 90, they were like just as big from a WWF audience point of view. They had an amazing, if you remember the intro music, still one of
yep,
the most iconic entrance musics are in there. And they created their own identity and became a standalone. But when Vince McMahon finally got the Road Warriors, as they were known, to come over to the WWF, things changed. And the reason that they didn't use their actual names, the Road Warriors, was because they already had the Ultimate Warrior. So the Legion of Doom was a name they used as part of a wider faction in the 80s. And that was the name that was used. And actually, from a marketing point of view, the whole LOD chant, everything worked really well. But them coming in, it was seen as the big kind of, we're going to see this rematch now, Demolition versus the LOD. but it didn't really play out. We're talking about things that should have been good and didn't play out, and this was another one of those because even though they came in and were initially programmed against Demolition, what they did was, as the first team, probably Vince McMahon took on his own creation and damaged it in favor of somebody coming from the outside. If you listen to the reaction of Demolition regaining the titles at WrestleMania 6, it's right up there with Warrior winning the title. It's that loud. But post the event, after some weeks, they introduced a third member of Demolition, Crush, who we'll discuss in future years, who became a bigger star than he was at this point. And they had three members of Demolition. They turned them into bad guys. The reason they had three was because Axe of Demolition suddenly became unwell, had some heart issues, and we won't go into detail right now. But you can see online there's various stories around what happened. He had a shellfish reaction in Japan. They thought he was going to be out of it, so they brought in a third member with the view of phasing him out. But that damaged the team, turning them into bad guys. Damaged the team. And the LOD were shown as the good guys now, but we never got that big blow-off match between them. I mean, you're going to talk about Royal Rumble and WrestleMania, and we never got that. What we did get was six-man tags with the Warrior, a few matches here and there, but we didn't get the big dream match that everyone was hoping for. But in general, this was a huge debut, and I think we didn't know their history at the time, and I think a lot of people that are our age wouldn't know their history. But they were you looked at them and they were this really super cool team. And I guess my last memory associated with them at this point in the discussion would be, I remember in 1992, everybody wanted the Legion of Doom action figures, and they were, I think, so much in demand that you could hardly find them anywhere. And I remember getting my hands on them in late '92. Somebody gave them to me as a gift, and it was that was the most sought after. So definitely, as people to this day say, they argue the greatest tag team ever, certainly from a character point of view and a whole image and impact. And this was a big find for the WWF at the time.
Yep, and I think what people don't appreciate about the Road Warriors and Legion of Doom is just how popular they were in the 80s. They took tag team wrestling to a new level. The popularity and stardom that they achieved as a tag team was probably second to none. They weren't mid-carders, they were main eventing shows all across the US. They were that popular. And they're probably a perfect example of what I mentioned in one of our in our introduction shows of people, wrestlers, characters that I had always thought were WWF characters, even though actually they spent more time outside of WWF than within. And the fact that they gained such massive popularity gave them strength in the back room, and that they would choose not to lose to anybody, and that's the way it would be. There was no way that they were going to lose to Demolition when they came in. As far as they're concerned, Demolition were an inferior product to them. They barely lost a match in NWA, in Jim Crockett Promotions, and WCW. They barely broke a sweat. They're renowned for not taking very many bumps in a match.
A bit like yourself.
A bit like myself, due to our big size. But there's no doubt that they were so over, and certainly one of my favourite acts of that time period. Just that look, and that music, the roar of that opening stanza, similar to when you hear Austin's
glass breaking.
That's the same effect.
Hulk Hogan's. Well, do you know they used to refer to anyone that got a loud reaction? It was referred to as the Road Warrior pop.
Yep.
So they actually became the first guys to make that, as you talk about, that initial roar famous. But you said they didn't lose to anyone. I mean, we're going to discuss it down the line, but they lost to Vince McMahon. But everybody loses to Vince McMahon.
Everybody loses to Vince McMahon. I mean, the other interesting thing about the Road Warriors, and I think it was their look. They were big, muscly guys, and they looked real. Like, you can't imagine any other tag team really beating them because they looked so impressive. And when it comes to Demolition, I know you were a massive fan of Demolition, and I've got to say,
Demolition,
I've never actually been a fan of Demolition. I've always found them really creepy. I always thought there's this weird S&M vibe going on, which I just...
Well, yeah, I think we're talking here about when we were like, you didn't really get it then, but
no, not then. But
I think in hindsight, people do see that they were. But like all of these characters were based on the Mad Max movies.
Yeah.
Even the Road Warrior name is based. So anyone now, this is going even guys, people older than us, right? But all these characters were based on that. But I see, I mean, when you think about it, like you said, the LOD, the Road Warriors were tough guys, right? That were being wrestlers. These guys were like wrestlers that were being portrayed probably the other way. And I think I thought the entrance music and everything made them, and I think they were good wrestlers in the sense that they did get popular with time.
Yeah,
But I think, yeah, once the real deal came in, it was difficult. But I don't think anyone expected it not to be the big collision, and Vince just kind of didn't care anymore. But yeah, I mean, LD, they're not going to last long here. They're going to be gone by '92. But at the time, they were still two of the biggest names, and to this day, people talk about them. Everybody knows them.
yep, definitely.
Another guy I want to talk about is somebody that's still, I think, to the mainstream public, the biggest and most popular British wrestler there ever was. Because I don't know if you remember, but the British Bulldog also returned to the WWF in 1990 as well. So prior to that, the audience that was watching had seen him as a tag team in the British Bulldogs. They left in '88, but here he was as a standalone performer now, and they got the copyright for the name, the British Bulldog, and he was there, and he'd certainly become a success over the next couple of years as well. And I think Davy Boy is somebody that we will cover in a lot of detail as we go through the years. But that was certainly a big thing for the UK market,
Yep,
having somebody
and
to root for.
I've got to be completely honest. Davey Boy was one of my, top 3, top 5 wrestlers back in the day. I've a great affection for him. I thought he had an immense look. Obviously, the British thing played really well for us. And I always thought that he probably didn't fulfill his potential due to lots of personal problems later on. And he was probably one of the best wrestlers not to win a world title. I certainly
Yeah,
believe that he
yeah.
could have won something, in that 90 to 95 period when he was around, and then eventually it became too late. But I certainly, I look back on him as a tag team wrestler and as a single performer as one of my favorite acts of all time.
And would you agree that he's still probably, even though there's been others like William Regal, and now you've got various people like Drew McIntyre, but I think if you spoke to the man on the street, the British Bulldog's probably still the one that everyone remembers when it
Yeah, he
comes
was.
to
I think he
British
was the
wrestling.
first, and the fact that he had the look going, the music, everything was very
Yeah,
British about him.
yeah,
Obviously,
exactly,
the name.
exactly.
So I think he's iconic with British wrestlers, and he paved the way for a lot of them.
Yeah, and we'll definitely be discussing him in more detail as we go along. And I think I just want to focus on 3 big debuts here, because obviously there's lots of comings and goings. But a third guy, you might have heard of him, The Undertaker. So The Undertaker debuted at the Survivor Series in November 1990, and who would have thought at that point that he'd be the longest running and most successful character creation ever? And I think I think when we were discussing this idea, it's probably his retirement in November of the past year and just discussions around it was one of the triggers that made us create this podcast.
Yep,
Because that's a
he's.
guy who everyone knows, right? For any generation to the
Mhm.
kids now, everybody knows The Undertaker.
Yep, and he's been ever present from the moment we started watching wrestling, all the way through to this day, and that's why I
Yeah.
think, he's. Many people would put him up there as one of their favorite wrestlers, and somebody who came in looking like nobody had seen back in the day. He was really tall, or he had this amazing facial expression, just almost deadpan, but super scary if you're a kid and you see the Undertaker.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, because
It's terrifying.
he lived that character. Because you're talking about it, I don't even think it was the fact that he was muscly and also. I think it was just when he walked out, and you go back, I would say to the people listening, go back to his debut, and the audience is just in awe of this guy. It was probably the greatest debut in terms of a baggy coming,
Yeah.
and everyone just buying it. And then the way he played that character and the way he developed it over time, it was just incredible. Because if you said a zombie, dead man,
Well,
Undertaker type
that's
character, right? How
yeah.
could that work with so many other characters flopped after a few years? But the guy lived it.
Yeah.
And to this point, now he's more out and about giving interviews and things, and it's great to see the characters thing. But he literally was the Undertaker, and
Yeah.
that's a testament to him.
And that's a good point about the what he was, as a character, because people criticize WWF and Vince for creating all these awful characters that didn't survive more than a couple of weeks, but the Undertaker could have been one of them, and the fact that he was so successful just shows some things do work. and you just got
Yeah.
to try. And he played the character so well over those initial years that it laid a foundation for what came
And to be
next.
fair to them, they've never positioned someone like him, because
No,
you look from that debut into what comes after, he was shown as bulletproof. And in the coming months and years, the good guys couldn't get really the better of him. The bad guys couldn't. And I don't think Vince McMahon's ever backed a character like that,
no,
where he's not, and he was never the main guy as in the champion for a long period or the flag bearer, but he was the one character that was protected more than anyone. But look, The Undertaker, we're going to have specials on him. There's going to be so much discussions around him, hopefully. But this was a key, and you could say probably the most key signing ever. And that's why we were keen to mention it in this road to kind of 91. And also his manager, Paul Bearer, actually debuted in February 91, because initially he came with the Brother Love character, who is, as everyone knows, Bruce Pritchard, who has his own very successful podcast that's basically led to all of these other podcasts coming into play. But initially that was the manager. And then Paul Bearer, who actually added to the creepiness
yeah,
and the fear in kids, the way he behaved, actually debuted in February of 91. So I think that was probably the three big debuts that I wanted to talk about. In
yep,
terms of departures, there was departures as well. I think if you compare both of them, there was more gains than losses, really, if you look at what happened over the long term. But the biggest departure was probably Rick Rude. So we've mentioned him before. He was wrestling for the title at SummerSlam 1990, but post that event, he had a disagreement, walked out, sat out his contract, and then he was in WCW by 91. Dusty Rhodes, who people remember in the polka dot look if you're a WWF fan, but if you're outside of that, he was a legend in NWA, WCW. So he came over in 1989, but Royal Rumble 91 was essentially his last show, and he went back to WCW. Probably a mixed run here, but what a lot of people might not remember or know is that everybody knows Goldust, but actually Dustin Rhodes, who played Goldust, his debut wasn't in WCW. He was actually in the WWF for a few months over this
yep,
period, introduced as Dusty's son, but they were both out the door by the February period that we're talking about. And I guess Jesse the Body Ventura, for really old school fans, he was the number one co-commentator from, I think, the first WrestleMania up to this point. He was one of the faces that made wrestling famous when it came to mainstream audiences. But he also had a bit of a disagreement before SummerSlam and walked out, never to really return on a full-time basis. And he ended up in WCW as well in '92. So there was movers and shakers here. But if you look at the names that are listing, they're all kind of legendary names that all wrestling fans will recognize.
yep. I mean, Jesse and Gorilla, they were our introduction to,
Yeah.
the voice of wrestling together. They played off each other really well along with Vince. And that was a superb pairing. And I think it took a while for WWF to get settled again once Jesse left. I mean, the Rhodes, as you mentioned already, Dusty was a very influential character in the wrestling scene in the US throughout the 80s and 90s. But he's also had a superb run as a proper main event performer throughout the 70s and 80s. And for what is in effect just a big fat guy,
Well, see, we didn't notice at the time, right?
Yeah.
Once again, we were watching, just saw him as a funny guy, had the polka dots, came out to a catchy song,
Yeah.
danced around, and that was it. But you didn't know actually that he was positioned like this, and he was actually Vince McMahon's, in many respects, number one opponent, because he
Yep.
was actually managing a lot of what was going on in NWA, WCW before he moved over. So some people saw the whole look as a punishment. To this day, people that represent WWE say that was not the case, but there's different views on it. But he was this, I guess, legend that we didn't know about at the time.
No.
We just saw him as another character.
Yep.
And that tells you about the knowledge gap that everyone had.
Yeah, definitely. And some would say he made Ric Flair throughout the 80s. Without him, Ric Flair wouldn't have had the popularity and the success that he has had now. And then moving on to just Rick Rude, my most memorable moments from Rick Rude are just the fact that he was such a superb heel for both Macho Man and Ultimate Warrior. I remember that blue steel cage match with the Warrior for the Intercontinental title. Superb. Always thought it was a bit weird that he was doing
that
that
on the
little,
world title? I think
that was the
the
second one, wasn't it? So
SummerSlam
it was
match. Yeah.
the SummerSlam match. But I always remember him gyrating his hips at the start of each match, and I always thought that's a bit odd or wrong for
Yeah.
all these kids to watch. But and the other thing that was most memorable about Rick Rude was his tights. So he would have them custom designed. When he was in a big feud with someone, he would have their pictures on his
Yeah,
tights
humiliate them. Yeah.
to humiliate them. I remember the Warrior ones and the Macho Man with Elizabeth. He was a superb character and actually a really good worker.
And what we learned later on was he was one of the toughest guys behind the scenes,
Yeah,
and somebody
definitely.
that respected. And you wouldn't see him back till 1997.
Yep.
And actually, he'd have a better run in WCW. They used him properly. He wasn't really used properly over here, but yeah, one of the key legends. And actually, you see to this day, you see a lot of people kind of copying some of what he does. He was definitely one of the unique characters and one of the best bad guys. But I just feel that they didn't position him properly, and that's why when it came to that feud for the world title, it had less impact because he wasn't presented as a top guy before that, even though he should have been.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Wrestling with Memories. That's all we've got time for today, but join us next week when we'll cover the rest of the early part of 1991, including the Royal Rumble, the Gulf War angle, and WrestleMania 7. We really appreciate you listening, and if you've got time, check us out on Facebook and Instagram. Just search for Wrestling with Memories. Give us a like and a share, and we'll see you soon. Bye.